George. While this is coming forward, I would just note that we have raised concerns that the support study is not the only study like this where parents of infants are not being informed of the risks of the research, the purpose. There's an ongoing study now involving transfusions called the TOP study, which we have called for a halt to until there's adequate addressing of the consent issues related to that trial. Alice?
So, my name is Alice Dreger. I'm from Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. I'm a historian of medicine and a medical ethicist. I can tell you historically that when ethical mistakes are found, like the problems in the support study, the usual reaction is to tighten regulations. Instead, what we see going on today is really worrisome. What we're seeing is an attempt to basically change or reinterpret the regulations, basically so that we can cover this up and say that this mistake didn't happen because the regulations say you're allowed to do this kind of thing. Many of us today spoke this morning to the fact that the existing regulations are perfectly adequate to deal with this kind of thing. And the mistakes that were made by well-intentioned people trying to do good science, but they shouldn't have been made under the existing regulations and under the existing IRB systems. It's a problem that they were made, and we need to recognize it and actually do something about that. This study may in fact be the tip of the iceberg in terms of problems with informed consent. I've been collecting a lot of stories of various kinds of studies going on in America today where people are either inadequately informed or not at all informed that they are in research studies. Instead of dealing with that, what we see is a chipping away of the rights of people who become the subjects of these experiments. Research is really important. It's important that we get better clinical care out of research, but we can't do that at the expense of the people who are the subjects of the experiments. They need to understand they're in studies and be completely fully informed and know what the alternatives are in terms of being or not being in the study. I have to tell you, it feels really obscene to me to be here today having this conversation without the parents of these children having been officially informed that we are having this discussion today. It feels really wrong to me that the parents who are here only because they happen to find out in various other ways that we're having this conversation. It feels wrong to me that we have a representative of the NIH defending the NIH works up on the panel, but we have no voice of the families that were in the study. Why is that imbalance occurring? I think what we're seeing here is a prioritizing of the needs of researchers before the prioritizing of the needs of research subjects. Certainly the needs of researchers are important. They do incredibly important work for all of us in terms of trying to find out what's good for us. But what we have to have is first and foremost, for the sake of research, a respect of the rights of people who are the research subjects. Thank you.
Thank you, George. George, you make some final comments, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Just real quickly, that last comment was exactly right.
A little louder.
You have to respect the rights and welfare of research subjects and patients. And what you've seen is, as a response to OHARP's very simple thing that subjects should be told about the risks of death if they're going to enroll in a research project, this kind of circling the wagons of every federal agency here and going against one of their own, the Office of Protection of Research Risk, and saying that they made a mistake, and if they continue on this line, they're going to somehow destroy the whole research facade of the United States and everybody's going to die. You know it's ridiculous when they say you're preventing them from saving babies. That's just nonsense. What you're trying to prevent people from doing is unethical research. You're trying to get people to just follow the rules that we've had for more than 50 years, basically. Informed consent applies to both research and treatment, right? That there's a difference between the two, but not about informed consent. That standard of care research, nothing special about that. We're not entering a whole new era where everybody's a research subject automatically, and it doesn't matter what the risks are. So this is a really important thing Public Citizen has done to bring this to the public, because that's the voice that's not being heard. It's the voice of the public.
Thank you, George. Questions from anyone of today's panelists?
Yeah.
Could you identify yourself?
Yeah, my name's Arthur Allen. I'm reporting for Science magazine. A lot of the discussion today in the panel, before the panel, has come down to the question of the wording of the informed consent, which it seems pretty clear was inadequate. It seems pretty clear to almost everyone who's spoken on, even on both sides. And yet, in New Zealand, they used this thing, and there were more people who entered the trial. So I guess what I'm trying to sort of disaggregate or separate is your criticism of the way the trial was performed versus the wording of the informed consent. Because you have a critique of the trial itself as well, and I guess I'd like to know what do you think that actual harm was done by the trial?
Sure. So on the consent issue in New Zealand, the New Zealand consent form for the parallel trial, Boost to New Zealand, was better in terms of noting the differences in mortality or eye disease that might occur in the research. But that consent form also had many inadequacies, and so that shouldn't be put forth as, here's a good example of how the consent should have been. It did address the risks somewhat better, but it had other deficiencies in terms of describing the nature of the research, how the research differed from usual care the babies would have received in New Zealand, and the purpose of the research. And so we shouldn't say this, if it had all been this, it would have been fine. In terms of the design of the study, you've heard some of the important issues raised today about the design of the study. So the study involved using falsely reading pulse oximeters and feeding that false information to the entire medical team, doctors, nurses, residents, and the researchers who designed that had no idea whether that was safe to do in the first place. It was really an unprecedented, extraordinary experimental procedure, and that alone you can't call standard of care, and potentially made the research unsafe. And in fact, the investigators described in their protocol, and it must have not, the IRBs obviously didn't pick up on this. There was a possibility that because of the falsely reading pulse oximeters, it could lead to babies being put on ventilators, having intubation, tubes placed in their windpipe to help them breathe when they didn't need it, or being taken off a ventilator when they needed to still be on the ventilator. Those were foreseeable risks of the research. They built in rescue criteria to stop using the research criteria if it happened 3 times back, intubate, reintubate, intubate, reintubate. If that happened 3 times, they were to revert to standard of care. So that procedure itself posed risks that were not well defined in the consent forms. The other fundamental point is we had 2 experimental groups in the oxygen experiment and no control group. And you can't monitor the safety of a trial, as Dr. Nadenson noted, if you don't have a control group that gets usual care. All you have is comparisons between 2 experimental groups. You might be harming both groups in different ways and not realize it without an appropriate control group. So there are fundamental design concerns about this research as well.
Let me just add a couple things. The reason I mentioned the New Zealand form was the narrow context in which it had been mentioned by OHRP. They said that at least on the issue of damage of low oxygen, New Zealand was able to inform people. And it said that on that one issue, if you American research centers had put that in, that part of the consent form would have been fine. As Mike said, there were other parts of the consent form that weren't, but at least whereas 0 of the 22 centers in the United States mentioned any risk of low oxygen, it was mentioned there. And the other thing, as Mike mentioned, I just want to elaborate for a second, is the danger to all 3 arms of the study, or 2 arms of the study, by not having a 3rd arm. If there had been a 3rd arm of usual care, this study could have been stopped much earlier by seeing differences that likely would have occurred in either eye damage or death between the usual care, the 85 to 95, and the others. So by not having a 3rd, you presented a risk to the other 2 groups. The study went on much longer than would likely have gone.
Other questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Sure.
Have you been told what arm your daughter was in?
No, ma'am.
No, ma'am. Have you asked?
We need to defer all those questions to our legal representation.
Is it listed? Have they refused to tell them, or is it that they're not blinded, or is it?
Anybody who's asked has not been given the information. Anybody who has asked which arm they were in has not been given the information.
We were simply given a letter from the hospital that she was at, and it just stated, your daughter was in this study, and we knew, because, and you may have heard things in the news.
So that's how
we found out.
Have you asked?
I've not asked. We refer everything to the attorney. information, obviously we'll get that in the course of investigation.
But I did not receive anything from the hospital stating that.
And what reason have you been given for, now that the study is over, parents aren't told what?
No reason.
No reason?
Ms. Cook, can you tell us what happened with your son?
That's it.
Sorry.
So we're going to need to move because HHS views this message that we're trying to throw as a threat to them, so they don't want us in front of the building. So we need to move over there.
Need to move over that side over here. Everybody, let's go.
We are illegally on federal property. We can keep asking the questions on the sidewalk. Is that right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Be over there. That's perfect. But we can't be here. Let's go.
You have done your job, and we've
Thank you.
This is what federal taxpayer money gets us.
Really? They brought on the police? Now, what's the name of your
What
group?
is your name?
Craig.
Property what?
Yeah, it's ours. She's getting it. So there's 3 motorcycles, some DHS, there's 2 SUVs, 3 SUVs, a car, no, 4 SUVs, 5 SUVs. It's a little bit of overkill.